And I'm Kathy, and I'm joining us from Lake County, Illinois. I would love it if when you come into the space, you would go down, open the chat, and go down to where it says to, and click the second option, panelists and attendees, and say hi and where you're joining from. We got Andrew in the background, who is in Minnesota, Be Strong Families Tech Support. Hi, Sandy Nunn, parent advocate from Coos Bay, Oregon. And Ahmad is joining us from Belfast, Ireland, or the United Kingdom, or they call themselves Ireland.
So it depends who you ask. It gets really complicated. People here can identify either way.
I see. Okay, that's like the conversation we were having before we joined about about identification and gender and trans, and it's fabulous. Hi, Gladys. Gladys, you're gonna want to say panelists and attendees, and Sandy, you're gonna want to do that too, because the thing is, this is the primary way that you're going to be communicating with each other and with us. So we want everybody to be able to see what you say. So hello, Heather from Abilene, Texas, and we're getting started. It's noon in the Midwest, which is, where we are, where I am. So I just wanted to go back one slide, please, Andrew, to welcome Ahmad Abojaradeh here. This is day 4 of our Decolonization for Wellbeing series, and we are delighted that they have joined us. They did Decolonization for Wellbeing earlier in our webinar series, and you should definitely check out all of the Decolonization for Wellbeing offerings. They're fabulous. Today, we are talking about mutual aid and support for community building, which I was saying before this started, this is a huge thing for me and Be Strong Families. We've done many webinars on mutual aid as a new paradigm for family support, and definitely a way to be able to build community around strengthening families. So typically a lot of people who join these webinars are in family services, and thinking about how we can build community and promote mutual aid and mutual support is a huge part of the work that I feel we need to do, and for a lot of reasons, but moral, ethical, but also just practically that we can uplift more people if we are one community, if we're building communities. So welcome to Ahmad, and welcome to all of you. And the next couple slides are just our housekeeping ways to engage. The primary one we use is the chat. You're welcome to type anything you want in the chat at any time. And questions, comments, can talk to each other in the chat, talk to us. And if you want to actually say something and be heard, there is a process for that as well. And that process is you raise your hand, that's at the bottom of the screen. Then Andrew will unmute you. You'll need to unmute yourself, and then you'll be able to speak. Second bit of housekeeping is that whenever Be Strong Families does anything, we gain agreement from the people who are participating in recognition that we co-create the safe space together. So these are our agreements for today. And if you agree to the agreements, do like Michelle and Andrew and Heather and Sandy, and type in the chat, I agree. Awesome. Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Michelle. Who else agrees? This is your warm-up, getting into the chat. We have more people online than have agreed. Great. Juliet agrees. Gladys agrees. Awesome. Okay. Thank you again, Ahmad, for being here, and welcome. And I'm really looking forward to today.
Awesome. Thank you again so much for having me here. And thank you to everyone here. I recognize some of the names from the last few days. So welcome back, everyone. And for those of you just joining us for the first time, welcome. It's so great that you're joining us. And like Kathy mentioned, definitely feel free to check out all the previous webinars. They all kind of go hand in hand together. So they kind of just build off of the existing knowledge. But if you haven't, that's perfectly fine, right? Each of them can also work as a standalone. So today I'm actually really excited about this topic in particular around mutual aid, peer support, just different elements of community transformation. And I'm specifically really excited about it because I feel like I've been doing this work for quite a while, and we're finally in a stage where we're able to really have some of these conversations around mutual aid. I remember a few years ago, prior to the pandemic, trying to talk to funders and communities about mutual aid, and they're like, why are you like this? Why are you talking to us about this? Right? Those sound nice, but they're not realistic and they're not where we need to be. And then the pandemic kind of changed a lot of that. So a little bit about my background into the realm of mutual aid, into peer support, into community organizing. So when it comes to mutual aid in particular, a lot of my learnings from that actually just come from my ancestral roots, right? As being an indigenous Palestinian, and hearing stories of, from like my grandfather, who was a farmer back in Palestine prior to having, prior to being displaced, right, because of war and so on and so forth. But talking about these times, right, where whenever it was like harvest season, everyone in town kind of came together and supported each and every single person. And it wasn't just the farmers coming together and being like, okay, like today on Monday, we're going to go to like Ahmed's like farm and we're going to harvest all the olives from the olive trees. And Tuesday we're going to go to that farmer and so on and so forth. It was literally just knowing that, okay, today is the time for my farm's harvest. And somehow the community just immediately knew and just immediately showed up. It wasn't all farmers, it was literally just anybody, anyone who had time, who had space, they would just show up and support one another, right? And at the same time, my grandfather would do the same for other families. And it wasn't just a farm to farm situation, right? It was maybe somebody needed a ride and somebody had a car, because not everyone had cars back then, right? That person would be driven. Maybe somebody is in the hospital and so someone is going to cook for them, right? Maybe somebody is just having a bad day, right? And so someone else is going to do their work for them, and just so on and so forth. And it's this community where mutuality was always honored, this reciprocity of everyone supporting one another, and this really real authentic honoring of that we all need support and we're all capable of providing support. It doesn't matter who we are in our communities. And it's always been really interesting having some of those conversations with my grandfather, who unfortunately passed away late last year, specifically around a lot of the challenges that exist today, right? So whenever I would talk to him about things like race, right, or gender or orientation and all of those different things, or like disability in particular, and it was usually like disability, gender and orientation, and he just would not understand, right? He would be like, I don't understand why you're telling me this is an issue, right? Where like I would go to him initially and be like, here are issues, and he's like, I don't get it, right? Like, what do I have to do with someone's gender identity? Right? Like, why is this a part of my life when it's their life? Right? Same with like disability. And he's like, okay, so I hear that like you can't do X because of your disability. So, and it was just these constant like bewildering like conversations, because I wouldn't be able to have those conversations with like anybody else at the time, right? Everyone else was like, yes, it makes sense. Everyone hates you because you're like gender queer or trans, or because you identify as queer orientation wise, right? Or whatever it is. And like to everyone else that made sense. To my grandfather, he was just like, none of that makes sense. That's not in line with like any of my values, with any of my communal values. That's not in line with the communities that he grew up in. And that to me was always just mind blowing. And that was really how I got into decolonization. And so that was years ago. So this is like me as a teenager and kind of coming to terms with my own identities and understanding that the world is so much larger than what I had been taught to believe in like my initial community in Arizona and then in Canada. And that was where I learned mutual aid. And it wasn't one of those things where it was like, here's a step-by-step process of you need to do this and then this. It was just a matter of being, right? And I kind of saw that within like the rest of the family, with how different community members showed up with one another, specifically for my grandfather's generation. And when I was 17, I actually had moved out, and I was homeless, and I was about 15 minutes away from the Syrian border. And Kathy, I don't know if you actually know all of this, but and so I was living 15 minutes, by living I was homeless, but 15 minutes away from the Syrian border, and this was the exact same time that the Syrian revolution started. And so overnight, a few months after I had been there, refugees started coming in, right? Displaced individuals started coming in without any spaces to live, right? No access to food, to shelter, to literally any of the basic resources, because it was like it seemed as if it came out of the blue, right? There wasn't enough time for responses to actually come together and people to be like, okay, how do we actually approach this, right? What do we do, right? The UN wasn't even involved at that point, right? So there was virtually zero services. And that was the first time I started organizing around mutual aid. Of even though I was houseless at the time, it was still like, all right, I still carry privilege. I still know individuals, right? Like, how do we actually just communicate with one another? And it was incredible to see how individuals just opened up their homes, shared their food, right? All of a sudden, mutual aid existed. And this was the very beginning of it, right? So this is before all the responses. And until the responses showed up, the community was able to take care of its own. And when I say the community took care of their own, even though it was two different countries, two different communities, they saw that humanity within one another. It wasn't a matter of like, well, they're different, right? They're this community and they're that community. It was literally like, okay, this person needs a space to stay. And it was like, okay, wonderful, right? Like, I have a spare bedroom, or I know this person that has a spare bedroom. Let me give them a call and let's figure this out. Um, and that was beautiful to see and witness and be a part of that creation of really just individuals honoring one another and building that. And so that was the first time I really supported building a mutual aid space. Um, and then immediately after that, for like years after that, every time I would try, in particular, I was in the United States at the time. A year later, I had moved to the United States. Um, it was really interesting of the various nonprofits and funders and organizations basically being like, that sounds nice to have, but it doesn't seem like a priority, right? Our priority is to work with individuals when they need it most. What you're talking about in terms of transformation sounds nice. I've literally been told, but we want to support effective work, right? Or what communities actually need and want. Until the pandemic, when that changed, when there was those first 2 weeks, at least in the community I was a part of in Connecticut at the time, where nobody really knew what to do. And it was like, great, we know what to do, right? And within those 2 weeks, immediately there was funding, there was access to resources. We ended up with 600 individuals across the state interested in creating something, and ended up launching 13 different smaller groups from within that, collectively supporting, I believe it was close to 25,000 individuals a week at its highest point. From all of those various groups, we supported, I think it was like 89 different municipalities across the state. We leveraged probably over $1 million in funding throughout the various groups and indirect support to individuals. And it was also a really great learning opportunity of what happens when you have all of that backing, but you don't necessarily have the infrastructure to maintain it, right? Where those priorities do not change long term. And so I'll talk about that a little bit later of what do we need to do, right, to make sure that the things that we're building are transformative. But I just wanted to kind of start with that as just an introduction into, here's how I got into it, right? And kind of a little bit of my journey. And it's been, I guess, 11 years since the first time I've organized mutual aid. And here we are.
Well, it's interesting. It's so interesting, Ahmed, because it's also in the family support principles. You know, we're in the family support field. In the family support principles, there's one that says, or premises, it said families are resources to themselves, to other families, and to the programs and their communities. You know, and yet that one doesn't seem to be actualized or operationalized as much as some of the other kind of more traditional social work paradigm relationships. So I think it's interesting. And yeah, what you say in terms of the professionalization, and we want to do things that are really effective. And the idea is like that only best practices and what evidence-based practice is effective, never mind the fact that, mutual aid has been effective in keeping families and communities alive for much longer,
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if it's kind of similar within like family support services, but I know in like a lot of the areas that I was kind of doing this work, whether it was like within like mental health spaces or substance use spaces, or specifically with like houseless populations, um, it was seen as like, why would we do this when we need to be putting our resources into getting somebody a house? And it's like, well, you're not getting people a house today, right? And the reality is there's so much trauma between here and there, right? There's so much going on that just addressing it with, here's the only response that we have, doesn't actually work for everyone. And I think that was really difficult for a lot of communities to hear. And it was seen as important. It was like, this sounds really nice. Like no one was like, ooh, that sounds really awful and like will never work and all that kind of stuff. It was always like, that sounds really nice, but it doesn't seem like the priority. Whereas from my experiences, right, the priorities was transforming our communities. Because like, for example, in Jordan, when that happened with the Syrian revolution, it wasn't a matter of like, okay, let's figure out, right, like who's actually like been really traumatized by this, or like let's figure out classifications of people and let's create a hierarchy of who needs what most. It was literally just seeing people, right, and saying, all right, individuals coming in have things that they are amazing at. They have their own skill sets. They have things that they can offer, even though they've literally just lost everything materialistic. And at the same time, the people in that community have the materialistic things, right? And they have a ton of other things to offer, and they also have their own needs, right? And so how do we just collaborate? How do we build that community immediately? And because of that, things happened almost immediately, right? It wasn't a matter of like, all right, let's pause for a few months, let's figure out like, all right, where are like the torture victims, and where's like who's been sexually assaulted, and let's only work with like children between the ages of 3 and 5. Because it was just seeing humanity of just people building that together. It happened almost overnight, right? Similar to what we saw with the pandemic, where very, very quickly things were able to move forward. And I think it's beautiful that we've gotten to where we are today, over a year later, and mutual aid is still on the table, right? We're still having these conversations, and I'm really excited to see, where we continue going with all of this. So if we go to the next slide, wanted to just highlight a few things that we've already kind of discussed. So for those of you that have already been, had joined us for the last 3 sessions, none of this is going to be new to you. And for those of you that are joining us for the first time, hopefully this just gives you a little bit of a framework of what we've kind of been talking about. So over the last few days, we've really connected with one of the major impacts of colonization, settler colonization, which is teaching us superiority and disposability. And in this conversation, just like every other conversation, that is absolutely critical, right? If I am trying to transform my community, but I view half my community as disposable, I'm not going to build a healthy community, right? Or if I view myself as superior to everybody else, or even at the same time, if I am working on building a community with other individuals, but I feel disposable, that I don't matter as much as somebody else within that community, whether it's because of some identity, whether it's just due to that impact, right, of colonization, settler colonization, there's going to be something missing. So it's something that we're still going to be highlighting today. And then in terms of tools, some of the tools for conflict transformation, we've talked about honoring autonomy yesterday a lot. We talked about valuing conflict and embracing shame/a love ethic. These are really, really critical, because as we build community, as we transform our community, conflict transformation needs to be there hand in hand, right? Because conflict will arise. It's not a matter of just, all right, there's 21 of us here today, right now, right, of all of us coming together and being like, okay, everything is perfect. We don't need to honor conflict. We don't need to embrace shame. We don't need to build a love ethic. We don't need to value conflict. We don't need to honor each other's autonomy. I don't know what we would build, but it's not going to be a healthy community. So those things are still really, really critical as we move into this conversation. And then same with accountability, right? That needs to go hand in hand. And yesterday, one of the things that we had mentioned is that if accountability does not lead to growth, it's not really accountability anymore, right? And as we transform our communities, that growth is constant, right? We're always moving, right? Getting to a place where our communities are just static, right? Where we have nowhere else to go, where folks are afraid of making mistakes and we're not actually moving things forward. There's no accountability there. There's no growth. There's no well-being. So we constantly want to be moving forward. And huge pieces of that are connecting with our autonomy and reevaluating priorities, which I will talk more about today, because the reevaluating our priorities, similar to what I had just shared in terms of my experiences with mutual aid and peer support and all of these different things, the main reason that wasn't working is because it wasn't a priority, right? It wasn't seen as a priority because it was seen as there was something better that we need to focus on. And I'm not saying focus only on mutual aid, right? Not saying focus on anything exclusively. I'm saying let's build space where everything can be there, right? Where we can have different things operating at the same time, because the reality is we have so many gaps and so many challenges at the moment, right? That we need it all, basically, right? It's not just a matter of, all right, let's, for example, with like houselessness, it's not a matter of just, all right, let's make sure that people have access to housing. No, let's definitely do that, right? But let's also make sure people have access to trauma-specific support, right? Making sure that individuals have access to other basic resources. Individuals have access to pathways for self-actualization, even if they don't have access to housing, right? Like all of those things can work collaboratively and collectively. It's just making sure that we're reevaluating our priorities. And sometimes reevaluating priorities isn't reevaluating a hierarchical priority. Sometimes it's like we've been talking about, it's getting rid of the hierarchy entirely and saying everything is a priority, right? Because again, we have very complex challenges and a lot of it going on, right? And so we'll talk a little bit more about that.
And sometimes in a non-hierarchical reevaluating priorities, sometimes it's about foreground and background, or this is up right now, like this is something that's up right now that I need to deal with, and it's like the urgency and importance and flowing with the circumstances, so.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% second that. And the cool thing with when we begin reevaluating our priorities, or even just have the intent to, we're able to, even those immediate things, right? The things that are right in front of us, where it's like, okay, like this needs an immediate response. What we're able to do, because we know that, for example, if like mutual aid is also a priority, right? As we're like wanting to develop access to housing, right? As the immediate thing, we're able to develop the immediate thing with the longer term transformative impact in mind. And so it becomes a stepping stone into that, right? Versus everything is completely separate. Nothing has anything to do with each other. Because when we create access to housing, why would we not create like mutual aid specific housing structures, right? Like it's not that we don't have housing, we do, right? And so that to me is one of the really cool things with those evaluations. And it is going to be so different for various individuals, various communities. And the beautiful part is just having those conversations and coming to terms with those things. So if we go to the next slide, I want to get us started with a pod building exercise just like yesterday. So we're going to do the first question of this, or you could answer either. And again, this is for those of you that are joining us for the first time and didn't check out yesterday's session. Pod building is a tool that was created by the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective. And we'll talk about what transformative justice is in just a second after this exercise. But pod building is a great visual exercise to just really map out who is within our community. So I was sharing yesterday that for me, initially, community was, all right, it was like the Muslim community and the trans community, and like, I guess within that, the gender queer community and the queer community, and then the refugee community and the migrant community and the disabled community, and so on and so forth. And that's a ton of people. That wasn't actually my community because I didn't actually have access to the hundreds of millions of individuals within all of those different groups. Right. And so they basically came up with this tool as a way of mapping out your own community. So when I ask, who is your community, right, really thinking of who are the individuals within your community that today you would classify as within that community. So if we go to the next slide, I'll actually show you an example of this. So feel free to grab a piece of paper, or you could do this on your computer if you want to kind of like sketch it out. And if you'd rather do this later, that's okay too. But basically, we're just going to get started with just putting ourselves in the center. So here it's just me. You can put your name, whatever you'd like to, but you are the center of this map. Everything else revolves around you. And I know that's kind of stigmatized slightly of having everything revolve around us, but I love when things revolve around me. And so this is just another opportunity for us to do this. So you'll have your inner circle. So you'll notice that in my drawing, right, I have 6 different ones. So with 6 different ones with solid lines, those are the individuals who are already a part of my community. Right. So looking at some of the individuals I have here. So I have my best friend, I have my mom, maybe my supervisor, maybe a fellow organizer, maybe a sister, maybe a partner. It could literally be anybody, right? Who's a part of your community, right? It could be somebody that you met here briefly, right? It could be a coworker that you don't actually know that well, but you feel so safe with them that you're like, that person is actually part of my community. Right? Maybe it's I don't know, a bartender or something that you've really connected with, right? Maybe it's somebody who works at the 7-Eleven across the street that you see every single day. Maybe it's actually somebody who you pass by every single day on your way back from work, who is houseless, but you're on a name on a name basis. You're constantly having conversations, and you're like, this person is part of my community. So you can include as many people as you'd like, or as few as you feel like you have. There's no wrong answer. So you don't need to have 6. 6 just looks visually pleasing, which is why I put 6 on here. But it could be 5, it could be 4, it could be 1, it could be 100, it could be as many as you feel that are part of your community. Then next, we have that outer circle, which are the non-solid lines, right? And so those are the individuals that you're like, all right, I want to invest in this relationship. I want this person to be a part of my community, but they're not quite there yet, right? Whatever it is, whatever is preventing you from that. Maybe, for example, like an example from like my own life, for example, like let's say that friend on like the left-hand side, maybe they're just in a different geographical location, right? And maybe over time, I want to move closer to them. And that's going to make me feel like they are in my community. Maybe until that happens, I want to invest into that relationship. Maybe it's an early relationship. Maybe it's a new relationship that you have, whether romantically or friendship, right? And you want some more time to invest into that to really make sure that this person is a part of your community. So this just puts the intention out there of these are the individuals I want to invest in for myself, for me to build this community. And lastly, you have these larger circles kind of on the corners. And those are more of like the community-wide resources or the organizations, whatever it is, but it's not one person, right? So it could be a collective. It could be the book club that you go to. So instead of having to name every single person in that book club, maybe it's the book club itself, right? As an entity now, where you feel that's part of your community. Maybe it's a religious center. Maybe it's Be Strong Families. Maybe it's a movement like Black Lives Matter. Maybe it's a community center. It could literally be anything. And so, but you want to name those. And in a similar fashion, if there are organizations or groups that you're like, okay, we're not necessarily there yet, but I want to invest in this, feel free to do the same as we did with those circles earlier on, right? Make it a dotted line circle to really put the intention out there of maybe I want to look at a lot more webinars by Be Strong Families first, right? Maybe I want to present a webinar for Be Strong Families to really solidify that connection. But then you're putting that intention out there. And ultimately, again, you would have kind of this visual of this is what my community looks like. right? It's not just an identity-based community or a profession-based community or anything else. It's not individuals that I haven't really connected with. It's, no, here are the exact people I know to call when I need something at 3 a.m. in the morning. And ultimately, as we kind of move this conversation into mutual aid and peer support, those are maybe the individuals that you want to build those practices with, right? People that are already a part of your community versus starting from scratch.
So Ahmad, this kind of exercise is part of what a lot of family support people do with people, is sit down and map their support networks. Like they don't talk about it in the same language like a pod, but their support networks and where they reach out. I'm also wondering if the Bay Area transformative justice people create lines between, like, I'm seeing this more as a web than as isolated circles, because your mom and your sister probably also have a relationship, and your best friend is connected with Black Lives Matter and MASGD or something, So that's also another interesting overlay to this, right? Which is the connection between your connections for.
Absolutely. And there's definitely some pod maps where you will definitely do that, and to really get into that level of detail. This is kind of like one of the simplest forms of it, but absolutely, you can go into so much detail. I've also seen some, and I haven't done this for myself, although it sounds really cool, but some people will also color code it, right? So it will be like, there's a difference between my mom and my sister, right? So maybe like, when it comes to certain elements of my community, I would go to my mom. And for other areas, it's my sister. And so you could also color code it for your priorities, right? What are the areas that of your community, right, that you're you're a part of, right? Because that will be different, right? My fellow organizer is going to be in completely different circles than maybe my supervisor at work, right? Or maybe all of them actually are also like best friends, right? Like maybe this is like, my community is also just that community, right? Like that the 7 of us would highlight each other as each other's communities. And so there's definitely a lot of ways to bring that level of detail into this. And absolutely, I do find that, like, in a lot of practices, because even in the mental health world, there are things like wellness recovery action plans and things like that, right? Where you're kind of listing out who are your supports, right? Who are like your crisis supports and things like that. And so it's definitely been out there for a really long time. I like this because it's just a visual, right? And it's something that, especially if I do it on paper versus on a computer, or even on a computer, it's something I can look back at, right? Later on, I can go and review it and be like, okay, what's changed? Right? What am I doing to invest in these individuals? Maybe a year from now, right? Like, I look at this, and if it's the exact same place, I might want to ask myself, well, I said I wanted to invest in all of these individuals, right? There's 6 individuals here that I said I want to invest in. What happened, right? Why did I not invest in those individuals? Maybe it's because I invested in other individuals that weren't listed here, and now I have other people in my circles. Or maybe it's just been a really difficult year and I haven't invested in people. Or maybe I just forgot. And it's a great reminder of like, okay, now maybe I want to kind of go back and invest in additional people in my life. And so it's a nice reminder to have in whatever format that you select for yourself, whatever makes the most sense. Yeah, so if we go to the next slide. All right, so we've talked a little bit about redefining or reevaluating priorities. I wanted to kind of just talk a little bit about it more like large scale, right? So over the last 4 days, we've been talking about decolonization for well-being, which is a very large topic, right? We've talked about conflict transformation, we've talked about accountability, and within those conversations, we've talked about embracing shame, we've talked about building a love ethic. Today, we're talking about more of the mutual aid, support realms, talking about actually transforming our communities beyond just 1 or 2 individuals, which we've kind of talked a little bit about over the last few days, but today we'll really highlight more of that community aspect. So really wanted to just highlight based on that colonization, settler colonization that we've been talking about, our current priorities in the vast majority of spaces that we may occupy, right? Hopefully a lot of you are like completely outside of this and you're like, this doesn't seem right at all. That's perfect. That's wonderful, right? But in a lot of spaces, the value of production is still one of the major priorities, right? Yesterday, I had shared, even within my day-to-day life, even as I was doing decolonization work, work was my number one priority, right? I was so invested within that was the only priority I could really see other than my sisters. And so the vast majority of places still kind of send that message, still have that as kind of one of our major priority. One of our other major things that's kind of happening is we have inequity at colossal scales, right, within our communities. And that doesn't say that inequity is a priority, right? But that currently inequity exists at a colossal scale. And so that makes a huge difference when it comes to our priority lists. We have values of capital and materialism, right? Again, what we own is more I guess more prioritized, right? More beneficial within mainstream culture than other things that we'll talk about later. We have disposability, still a huge landmark thing. And even though those don't sound like priorities, they're still priorities because they're major things that we have within our foundations, kind of all around us. And we also have a shame ethic, right? Of feeling that we'll constantly be shamed, and then kind of this fear of shame, which leads to additional shame, and it becomes, instead of a love ethic, we just have a shame ethic. And instead, we need to get to a place where our priorities are valuing individuals, right? Where we have equitable access to needs across the board for everybody, where we build a love ethic like we've been talking about, right? And currently building a love ethic is not necessarily a priority in the vast majority of places. It sounds nice, right? Even in places where it's like, okay, well, similar to like those organizations I was mentioning earlier, right? Where it sounds really nice, sounds like a really great idea, but we don't have time and space for this, right? So it's not a priority, even long-term, right? Ingrained within everything that we do. Mutuality is huge. And in this case, what we're really meaning with mutuality is that it's not a expert to a patient or a person receiving services relationship, right? It's not me, Ahmed, has all the knowledge and nobody else here has any, right? Of that, my entire purpose here is to educate and everyone here is just learning. Mutuality would be that I'm also learning from everyone here, right? Every time somebody comments, right? Or every time Kathy says things, I'm constantly learning, right? Like I don't know everything and I don't pretend to know everything. And having that relationship, right? Where I know my areas, right? And I'm comfortable in that and I own that of I know the things that impact me and my own identities and the work that I've done. And also, there's a billion things I don't know anything about, and I am fully comfortable with that, right? And I'm willing to take that step back to learn from others, just like I'm willing to step up and support others' growth, right? When it comes to a lot of topics. So that's where that mutuality is. We want to build a community where that's always constant, right? Where we have that as a priority versus more of a hierarchy of teacher student exclusively, right? It's so much more complex. It's we all have so many different roles, and we all honor and value each other. And then we have accountability and growth specifically through transformative justice in this specific circumstance. And I'll talk a little bit about what transformative justice is, but accountability and growth in general, right? We want that to be a priority. Work is not the priority. Capital and materialism are not the priority. All of those things are not priorities. It's we want to be growing constantly, right? We want to walk through that journey of accountability like we talked about yesterday, and get to where we need to go. And then lastly, and this one seems like it's very obvious, but I find that in most spaces it's still not, of well-being is a priority, right? Of that should be one of the major priorities, working hand in hand with the other immediate priorities. And so again, everyone is going to have their own priorities. Your spaces are going to have your own priorities. This is just kind of one example of based on larger societal structures, right, of what we currently have and where hopefully we can get to.
So
So if
Dana
we,
says, as a single parent, I see the need list as where I'm trying to actually parent from. It's the things that matter for individual growth and development, much more so that global growth and development. So I'm just saying people are vibing with it, like from the parenting perspective. And what I just thought is like, I don't know, when I was doing my writing the last article in terms of the fractal epistemology, and I know those big words, but like one of the issues is binary. Like we have current and we have what we need, you know, and we have, it seems like it's almost like an either or. And then there's this idea of non-binary, but there's also like a meta trans binary possibility, which is that it really is both and. Like we don't have to completely, there probably will always be some inequity, whether it's but we can reduce the scale, you know, and maybe we will still value production because we need production in order to keep things, you know, going. But
yeah,
we can merge those things and value individuals at the same time. So it doesn't
yeah,
necessarily, it's not like we have to jettison the past in order to get to the future, or we have to, you know, choose one or the other,
yeah,
order one or the other up, right?
yeah, absolutely. And
And
it's
you said yesterday, like while we want to be more in the love ethic or the shame than the shame ethic, shame is also a very valuable, you know, emotion, feeling, you know, ethic that exists so that we can reflect on and continue growing. So
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I love how you place that with like the non-binary and the trans-binary and so on and so forth, because it's not just what we have and a future vision, it's so much more, right? It could be everything, right? Because you're absolutely right of that value of production isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? It's currently harming us in the ways that it exists. We can have a value of production that's incredibly healthy, right? That goes into everything that we've been talking about. And shame is a perfect example of that, right? Of this shame ethic that we have today is really harmful. Embracing shame to me is part of love ethic, right? Of like, it goes hand in hand with that. And so I really appreciate
transformation.
that framing of it, and absolutely right. And so as you're doing this for your own spaces and your own practices, but really think of those things of what else is possible, right? We're such creative individuals that there's no either or, there's no just one solution. It's literally whatever we set our minds to. And really the major thing with the defining priorities piece is just making sure that you have a mindset of here are the values, right, that I want to invest in to build everything else. And that's all that matters, right? Everything, like you could be working, and I talk about this when I talk about burnout, for example. For me, burnout isn't about working 80 hours a week, right? That doesn't lead to burnout for me, right? Like I can do 80-hour work weeks and love my job and it's perfectly fine. To most people, that sounds like awful, right? And it sounds like it's immediately going to lead to burnout and it's going to be the worst thing for my well-being. Whereas like for me, that's perfectly fine. My issue is when half of those 80 hours are conflict that's never actually transformed, right? It's us not moving forward in certain areas. Those are the things that harm my soul, right? Because those things go against my values. Whereas working 80 hours a week, I don't do it often. I don't do it anymore. I don't want to do it, but it doesn't lead to burnout, right? It's so much more complex than that. So I really appreciate that.
Well,
So if
when you're
we,
talking about your values, I guess when we were teaching, when we in part of our personal development, we teach about values. It's like how you spend your time, how you spend your money, who you surround yourself with. If you look at those things, those are really your values. And sometimes what happens is we have a set of values that we want to be living, but there's a huge disjuncture between our ideal values and really what we're living as our values. So I think that leads to burnout too. Like if you say you value family, but you're spending no time with your family, that's that's stress for your soul, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely love that. So let's go to the next slide.
Randy says, while you're doing this, this is reminding me of the term moral injury as the true cause of burnout.
Beautiful. Yeah, I appreciate that. And yeah, I mean, we're such complex beings. Our communities are so complex. Our relationships are so complex. Everything's going to be complex, and it's beautifully so, right? And so one thing that leads to one person's burnout is actually going to lead to something very different for somebody else, which is where transformative justice kind of comes in. And I talked about this briefly yesterday, but really just wanted to highlight it. Transformative justice is specifically a practice that was created by the most marginalized for their own communities, specifically because due to inequity, state-sponsored different things, right, were not necessarily available for that support, right? It was specifically created by individuals who were deemed disposable by the state. And the state can mean a lot of different things, right? But whatever structure, whether it was within a community, whether it was within a state, within a country, whatever it is, but individuals who were deemed disposable, right, coming together to create their own pathways for accountability, for moving forward, for growth, right? And so within a transformative justice practice, mutual aid, peer support, all of those different things could become outcomes of it. But it's basically, if let's say I am sexually assaulted within a community, right? The immediate response in the vast majority of spaces is, all right, well, call the cops, right? Like file a report, let's get this person off the streets. That doesn't always exist to everyone. And also, I think a lot of us acknowledge that the prison industrial complex is not necessarily the most helpful, right? It doesn't actually lead to communal transformation. It doesn't actually help the victim or the perpetrator or the community. It actually just stops things. It makes us avoid the actual problems going on. So instead, transformative justice is basically, all right, how do we honor the person who this has happened to? How do we honor the needs of the community? How do we honor the needs of this individual who has made this really horrible mistake, right? And how do we make sure this never happens again within our communities? And again, a huge piece of that could be mutual aid. It's built off of, they kind of all go hand in hand, where because we're honoring everyone, transformative justice would automatically fit into that mutual aid practice. Now, this isn't saying that everyone here has to be like, okay, imagine the absolute worst thing a person can do, and we're always going to go through a process to receive accountability and like 0 prison sentences and all that kind of stuff. This isn't even going into that end of that. This is basically acknowledging that within the current structures that exist, right, we can pretend as if a person who perpetrates a sexual assault is going to go to prison for the rest of their lives, right? The reality is, in the United States, I think it was 3% of women in particular will see their sexual assault perpetrators behind bars, right? 3%. So the problem is so much larger than that. And when we look at various groups, again, who have that disposability, the state hasn't necessarily been there, right? So for example, if I was sexually assaulted by somebody who is Black, for example, me calling the cops might lead to that person dying. Potentially somebody who is undocumented, right? Now that person is deported, right? Potentially it's an asylum seeker or something like that. And now they have to go into an even worse environment, and I may have signed that person's death sentence. And so transformative justice became a practice that certain communities have built, right? Again, for them to establish what does accountability look like, not just for one person, but for the community. Because if this existed within a community, within a space, then there's a role that we all played in it, right? There's accountability needed from everyone, as well as that individual who caused this really awful harm.
So I have a basic question, Ahmad, and I get that this is created within queer, trans, BIPOC, and disabled folk communities for justice within the community. But I really feel like for transformative justice to be effective, like white cisgender males need to have a role in it as well. You know, do you know what I'm saying? Is like, it seems to me they can and they do and they need to participate in transformative justice for it to be truly transformative, because especially if they're perpetrating or we are perpetrating, I should say, we are perpetrating historically the injustice, you know?
Yeah,
Is that
yeah,
on point, or is transformative
absolutely.
justice only
Absolutely.
within these communities?
No, so it's possible to be in any community, right? And ultimately, if
Or
it,
between communities, that's what I'm saying, is like, can it be in the larger community, between communities we use this, you know, where,
absolutely.
okay.
Absolutely. And so what I would say is thinking back to that pod, right? Of who is your community, right? What does that look like? Who are the people around you, right? You're able to do that with any community. And then you're able to do it cross community as communities kind of reach that same stage together, right? Where the reason I highlighted that this was built by the most marginalized for the most marginalized is because unfortunately, there's so much harm out there, right? And very limited investment, even in terms of like time and space and what individuals are really capable or are able to move forward with. That so far, it's really been those communities that have been doing it together, right? Now, as we grow this, right? So everyone on here, if you're interested in building this for your own communities, absolutely, right? And then once we're building it within various communities, all communities, Kathy, to your point, specifically communities of privilege, right? We're able to begin that transformative justice for all of these communities together versus just communities separately. So it's a great practice to really transform our society once it actually gets everywhere. Currently, it's not there yet, but it will get there hopefully one day. I hold hope at least. So if we go to the next slide, I know we don't have too much time. So I want to highlight peer support and mutual aid in terms of what they actually are. So I want to differentiate between the two slightly. So some of you may have heard of the concept of of peer support, and the others may have heard of mutual aid, or maybe you've heard both. And a lot of times they'll kind of be utilized synonymously, but there's slight differences between them. So everything that we talked about mutual aid is kind of true for peer support, except for that peer support specifically centers individuals with shared lived experience, right? So, for example, when you're thinking of parenting, right, it's not, although I like parented my younger siblings, but let's say I have no children of my own. Let's say I did not parent my younger children and I don't know anything about parenting, right? It's not about me going and supporting a family and being like, let me actually support you through this, right? Of I know certain things and all that kind of stuff. No, it's parents supporting one another, right? So that would be more peer support. And if we go to the next slide, and I can read off like the full definition later, or people can look at it all later. But with mutual aid, the beauty with mutual aid versus all these other things, and peer support is absolutely beautiful. I still do my own peer support practice. I support individuals and like getting certification for peer support. Love peer support. It's absolutely necessary. Mutual aid allows us to take that same model, but expand it to everybody, right? Where it's no longer just about parents supporting parents or people living with mental health challenges supporting other people with mental health challenges. It's literally a model that says every single human being that has ever existed and will ever exist needs some kind of support. And every single person has something that they are able to contribute to the community back. That is all mutual aid is, right? If I have different things to offer, Kathy has different things to offer that are going to look differently than mine. My needs are going to be different than Kathy's, and same with Andrew. Andrew is going to have different needs and different offers, and so on and so forth. And so we're all able to do this collectively together, hand in hand, as we go through all of this. And I feel like we've highlighted a lot of that over the last like 50 minutes or so. But if we go to the next slide, I do want to highlight a few things in the last few minutes before before we end for today. In terms of what does mutual aid actually look like, we've kind of been talking about this all along, right? So when we were talking about reprioritization, when we've talked about well-being, when we've talked about the moving beyond the impacts of colonization and settler colonization, when we've talked about building a community-wide practice of support, when we've talked about mutuality, when we've talked about dismantling inequity and achieving justice, when we've talked about community growth and building a love ethic, when we've talked about embracing shame, when we've talked about prioritizing well-being, literally everything that we've talked about is what mutual aid looks like. right? There is no, okay, I'm going to give this to Kathy. Kathy's going to give the same equivalent thing to Andrew, and Andrew's going to give it to somebody. No, it's literally just, I have needs. I have things I am able to contribute. Same with every other person. And it's us building space where everyone feels comfortable in asking for what they need and also feel empowered to share what they have, whatever that looks like, right? What they have is not money. It's not just access to housing. It's not just food. It's literally anything, right? Maybe I'm a good listener and that's what I can offer. Maybe I can read children's books to children every once in a while. Maybe I can babysit. Maybe I can actually give you food. Maybe I can give you money, right? Maybe I need support with housing, whatever it is, right? That all of those things are mutual aid. If we go to the last slide, just really quickly want to highlight a couple things for everyone to kind of leave with. And I don't mean to like leave on like almost like a slightly sadder note, but these are kind of some of the things that we actually need to do to make mutual aid transformative. Right, Kathy, to your point of transformative justice, there are things that are absolutely necessary to really get to that place where it fully transforms our entire society. So here are some of the major things, and we've already talked about all of these things. I'm going to start with the bottom and then go up to that inequity. So we want to honor autonomy in every way, right? We talked about this yesterday, and honoring our own autonomy, honoring others. We want to make sure that happens. And when that does, that becomes a huge pillar for that transformation. We want to end the concept of disposability. We don't value one another based on identity or production or anything else. It's literally that we are all worthy. We all deserve to be here. We want to reprioritize our values, like we've kind of talked about, just reprioritize everything, right? Of not a hierarchy of how does everything just work together, right? We have capital today of capitalism is a thing. Capitalism inherently is not evil, right? Like we can build a love ethic within that, right? We're able to transform everything around us, right? To get to where we need to go. I do want to highlight this first point lastly as a really, really critical point. So one of the things that we saw happen with mutual aid during the pandemic is that communities came together and it was beautiful, right? Where literally tens of thousands of people were involved with mutual aid around the country. What unfortunately ended up happening eventually is the individuals who were supporting one another, who were asking for support and receiving support, all were living with such severe levels of inequity that what ended up happening over time, no one had anything left, right? Because we gave it all up and there wasn't enough coming back into the system. And so for this to truly work, we have to begin bridging that inequity on a larger scale, right? If wealth redistribution doesn't happen, we're not going to do wealth redistribution just by having a group of people who don't have access to wealth supporting one another financially, right?
Well, that's why I was saying you're not going to have transformative justice if you don't have,
exactly.
perpetrators also involved, and so it's kind of like, how do we open build community on a grander scale?
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. And so really wanted to just highlight those things. I believe that we can get there, right? I believe with intentionality that specifically just for each of us on our own, for our own smaller bubbles of communities, the individuals closest to us, even like the organizations around us, the community centers, the religious centers, I've seen amazing things happen within all of those spaces. And I hold hope that one day, when enough of those communities transform, that we can collectively come back together and fully transform all of it.
Yes.
I hold that hope. And so thank you
That's
for
awesome.
allowing me to share all of this with you all.
Thank you for sharing. It was wonderful. It was really, really amazing week and grateful. Looking forward to next time and future collaborations. Ahmad, I appreciate you. Next week, we're going to continue our June Journey to Vitality, and Dr. Judith Ehrman Shapiro will be on tap to offer 4 sessions on navigating grief and loss with different topics, different focuses. And then on Friday, we're going to have a cafe, a Grief Compass Cafe. So register for these webinars, and we look forward to seeing you next week. And I just want to, again, a little shout out and a thank you again to Ahmad for being part of the content design team for the newest resource Be Strong Families is putting out in terms of Vitality, which is the Grief Compass and Navigating Trauma and Loss Cafe Booster Pack. We were very grateful to have a diverse group in the content design team that was really committed to embedding the decolonization for well-being perspective and reclaiming indigenous wisdom. So thank you, Ahmad, again, and check out these resources online. Ahmad, I wanted to say, are you familiar with the healing lodges in Canada?
Yeah.
Just in terms of like alternative incarceration for indigenous peoples, because the system didn't work at all, was recognized as not working. Do they work? Are they viable? Are they expanding? Do you know anything about what's going on there?
So I don't know if they're expanding or like what that piece looks like. I do know that they have been very effective in some of the communities, at least the ones that I've heard of. I know they're kind of the equivalent to like the transformative justice work that's happened in it's happened in like Oakland, in Brooklyn has some, Philadelphia has some, and some of them have been really, really great. It's been kind of interesting looking at the various ones, where kind of similar to that final conversation, where in some of the spaces, because inequity is so great, that they're effective for a time period, but over a longer period of time, it stops really being effective because there isn't much investment going into it. So I know a couple of like organizations that have had to shut down, unfortunately, that did practice transformative justice. But as far as I know, the ones those healing lodges are effective from the communities that I know.
And one more question before we probably get bumped off, but is let's see, we've got, yes, yeah, that's right, Dana. That's what I was going to. Is restorative justice and transformative justice, are they cousins? Are they partners? Are they synonyms? They're
more, let's say they're cousins. They're kind of like cousins twice removed sometimes. So it really depends on the frameworks of restorative justice. Transformative justice is a little bit newer, I guess, in terms of like it reaching mainstream society. And so it hasn't really been altered as much. With restorative justice, because now it's become as large as it is, there have been a lot of changes from like the core model. And so the core model itself would be cousins to transformative justice. They would be able to work hand in hand. Some of restorative justice has kind of moved away from that sometimes. The biggest difference, at least that
co-opted in a way, or
it has, in a lot of spaces, it has kind of gotten co-opted. I will say that restorative justice is specifically meant on either there's kind of two elements to it, of either supporting the systems themselves, right, of bridging those gaps, right, so for example, for sexual assault prevention, how do we actually work with the justice system to make sure that justice is happening, right? Or how do we work individually with people, right, and kind of utilize more of a meditation model to support individual healing and growth between an assailant and their victim. The key difference with transformative justice is that transformative justice operates outside of the system because it's never really had access to the system initially. And it's a community process. So it's not just about the victim and the assailant, it's always holding the entire community accountable, and supporting that transformation that needs to happen so that it never happens again. So slightly just different levels, but yes, they're definitely related. Would be like cousins in some places. They're like a couple times removed, but usually they're cousins.
Looks like she left. Well, I haven't seen that one before, but thank you so much, Ahmad, for joining us this week. This was wonderful. And all of these resources will be on our YouTube page as well as our webinar recordings page. And yeah, everybody have a great